Shakespeare once wrote that misery acquaints a man with strange bedfellows, and if he were still alive and kicking, I suspect our man Bill would appreciate today's episode, Taplines listener. Though beer is the opposite of misery for the American drinking public writ large, the business of brewing and selling beer is riddled with operating requirements, licensing lead times, and regulatory mandates that range from bearable to burdensome. And that's just talking about today. After 2 decades of craft brewer-led reforms at the local, state, and even federal levels have hacked back some of the thickest stretches of red tape wrapped around the American beer business. Before that, if you were a small-time brewer in a state with Byzantine beer laws on the books, things could be pretty miserable. Which is where those strange bedfellows come in. In 2012, New York State had just 95 breweries, dramatically fewer than its third-in-the-nation population suggested it should. Just 6 years later, thanks in no small part to the enthusiastic boosterism of now-disgraced former Governor Andrew Cuomo, no beer fanatic himself, but a savvy political operator never missed an opportunity to burnish his populist bona fides, that number had more than doubled, and the Empire State was well on its way to becoming the craft beverage hotbed it is today. Chris O'Leary, the globe-trotting founder and editor of the venerable Brew York blog and a longtime observer of the state's political brewing landscape, joins Taplines for the very first time to break down the pivotal 2012 summit in Albany, where New York's craft brewers bent the gubernatorial ear to their regulatory woes and forged a fruitful alliance with a notoriously sharp-elbowed striver that would jumpstart the state's then-lagging industry and serve as proof positive to fellow brewers across the country that, miserable though they may be, sometimes politicians were worth getting into bed with. It's Cuomo's 2012 Craft Beverage Summit, it's Brew York's Chris O'Leary, it's the Empire State's big bet on small brewers, and it's all right here, right now, on Line Pairs Taplines. Let's hear it for New York! That's right, Taplines listeners. I'm joined today by the man who has gone every which way in the Empire State's brewing industry, covering it from Buffalo to Rochester to Albany to New York City to all of the cities on Long Island that I can never really remember, but all kind of sound like moccasin brands, Syosset, Mineola, and things of this nature. I'm talking, of course, about Brew York editor, publisher extraordinaire, Chris O'Leary. Chris, welcome to Taplines, man.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks for having me.
We are here today to talk about a state that you have covered for many, many years, and of course reside in when you're not globetrotting, visiting thousands of breweries around the world. And I lived in New York, and that's how we know each other, because we go way back at this point. But why don't we start with where you are at this very moment? Are you in currently the concrete jungle where dreams are made of?
I am. I am actually home. I just got back from a European jaunt over 4th of July week, which was fun. Went to England, Austria, and Slovakia. Visited another 23 breweries on that in those 10 days. So
just some light work for you, Chris.
Yeah, it really is.
That's nothing. Listener, if you're not quite aware of what we're joking about here, you should know that Chris has visited. Well, Chris, what's the total as we record this?
3,125.
Good God, that is just roughly, if you visited a brewery a day for 10 years, you'd be right around that count. Chris has been all over the country, all over the globe. You visited breweries in every state, right? All 50 states. And correct. In how many continents at this point?
4 continents.
And there's none in Antarctica, so you throw that one out.
No, I know.
Yeah.
2 to go there. And I believe the count is now 24 countries.
24 countries. So I've had the pleasure of interviewing you, Chris, several times over the years. If your reporters looking for this, I would happily offer Chris up to, by all means, steal my source. If you're ever looking for on the ground literal shoe leather reporting of what tap rooms around the world look like, what's going on in them, what people are interested in, how they're decorated, et cetera, et cetera. I can think of no better resource Chris and I have known each other going on almost a decade at this point, and we're glad to finally have you on Taplines, my man. But today we're going to be talking about a very specific state. We're going to be talking about New York, and we're going to be talking about not one brewery, not 3,400 breweries, but really the industry as a whole and the way in which the state government in New York was able to catalyze the growth of the craft brewing industry in a really meaningful way. About a decade ago, about 11 years ago from when we're talking right now. So, Chris, with that said, let's scroll the Taplines time machine back to, what was it, 2012? The year is 2012, and we're gonna zoom in on Albany, where there's a very important event that is in process, that is taking place. I know that many listeners know that New York's craft brewing scene these days is very, very successful and very robust. But Chris, it wasn't always that way, was it?
No, it wasn't. In 2012, in fact, there were around 75, 80 breweries in the state. A lot of them were still holdouts from the 1990s brew pub boom. In fact, in New York City, we had 4 breweries at the time. And the state was falling behind when looking at its peer states. We are the second most populous state, and we're seeing California, the most populous at the time. I think that was before Texas slipped into number 2.
Yeah.
And the beer scene in California was just blowing up. And,
world class. Yeah.
Yep. Especially in places like San Diego and the Bay Area. So there was a lot of talk about how could we replicate that here? Like, why are we lagging behind? What is really holding us back? We had a State Brewers Association. We still do, obviously, but we had a State Brewers Association that was trying to get an ear in Albany to listen to their concerns and try to find ways for it to grow, because a lot of these breweries were upstate and in economically depressed areas, and they could be opportunities for economic growth. And that was the angle that they were playing with state government there, to try to see ways that the brewing industry could grow. And also, we're coming off a pretty tumultuous 2 years for the relationship between brewers and the state liquor authority at the time.
Right, the SLA. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So there had been a bit of a kerfuffle. Wow. Jeez. I've only had 2 sips of beer. Between the SLA and brewers over brand registration. So the state liquor authority had previously waived brand registration rules, brand registration fees, for New York State brewers, while forcing out-of-state brewers and importers to pay those fees. And as a result, an importer took legal action against the state because of that. And the SLA made the decision, instead of waiving them for everyone, to have everyone file those brand registration forms and fees.
Instead of less taxes, more taxes for everyone.
Exactly.
It's a very popular, politically defensible position. People love it when you tell them that they have to pay more taxes. It's a very, very popular thing to do. Yeah.
So like, and the thing was, at the time, there were most of the breweries that were bringing beer into New York from outside New York were merely just bringing their flagship, their core brands in. This was not in the era where, breweries would have, tons of rotators that they would bring into another market.
Right.
But the breweries within the state, especially the much smaller ones that were just starting to experiment, were making, upwards of 50 or 100 different beers a year. So you're looking at brand registration fees that would amount to more than their annual licensing fee.
Right.
For a brewery that was making less than 500 barrels of beer a year.
Sure.
So it really had soured the relationship between the state and alcohol producers. Adding to that was the fact that the SLA was just a massive bureaucracy. It would take, upwards of 6 months to get approval on a license application, sometimes even longer than that. And that's just time that a production space is sitting idle, just waiting, just paying rent and not generating any revenue. So
right.
That was those were the two major issues that beer producers had at the time with the SLA. But with the state as a whole, if they could create a relationship there, the hope was that they could create a regulatory environment that would be beneficial to the growth of the industry, not just getting us back to a point where they can function normally.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I remember those were like kind of darker days for New York craft beer as a consumer, certainly. And like, I know, listener, this can feel a little wonky and in the weeds, and we go there sometimes on Taplines, but it's so important, right? Because like what we're talking about is business economic development and its business growth. But what it really winds up being is whether or not you can have a sustainable, viable environment to brew small beer, right? To make this work at the local level. And like you said, a lot of the brewing constituency was located upstate in economically more depressed areas. If you've ever been, driving around upstate New York, much of it is quite lovely, but some of it, or a lot of it, is rough because there's just no jobs there anymore. Factories have left over the years as NAFTA kicked in, and even prior to that. So like these are opportunities for decent paying, sometimes well paying, depending on the brewery in the area, manufacturing jobs. That there's a political component to that as well. I mean, politicians, for whatever their feelings are about alcohol, as long as they're not, barnstorming temperance advocates, they will likely go for jobs over any concerns they have about a vice like alcohol. So jobs are on the mind of New York State's politicians at this time. I love the idea that like looking to California is like, fuck, like California has all these incredible breweries. Obviously a hotbed of craft brewing. We're recording this in mid-July when the news about Anchor Brewing Company being closed by Sapporo USA. Yeah, Chris has got the Anchor glassware, drinking the Anchor steam that he opened with the Anchor bottle opener in honor. So, but Anchor, of course, was a major and still is until such time as it's closed. We'll say it's still on life support for the time being as we record this. Incredibly influential, drives the Northern California beer scene, which itself drives the entire California beer scene. California is this major player. And if you ever want to get a New Yorker to do something, take action on something, you just have to tell them that California is doing better at it. And so that's the scene that we set here. What were you drinking? What were people drinking from New York at that time? 2012 here. What were people excited about? I'm trying to think back.
So you had
Brooklyn, obviously.
Brooklyn,
Drinking,
Yep. You had 6 Point. And 6 Point at the time was still brewing all of their beer in. Actually, I think they had just started to do some contract brewing to package their beer in cans. But
with
they
who?
did,
FX
they were
Matt?
doing that. No, they were. I think they were at the Lion Brewery in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, before they had moved out to Memphis. That part of their operation. You had. You had Chelsea Brewing in the city. I mean, I'm just talking in the city, but there was a lot of Saranac out there made by FX Matt.
That's right.
That was kind of one of my gateway beers. You had Genesee. As far as the craft players, Southern Tier They were pretty big at the time. In Syracuse and Rochester, you had Empire. In fact, the founder of Empire, Dave Kadaleski, was the head of the president of the New York State Brewers Association at the time that this is all going on.
Mm-hmm.
I think there were a lot of regional brands that still dominated, and you had a handful of old school.
Keegan's mother's. Did they have Mother's Milk? Remember that?
Yeah. R.I.P. Tommy Keegan. He was a legend. Captain Lawrence was fairly new at that time.
Blue Point, obviously.
Blue Point. Yeah. How can we forget? I mean, Blue Point
that was pre AB InBev, right? Because they did. They got acquired in 2014. Blue Point
Correct.
did, I think. Yeah, if I remember. Yep. Okay, so that kind of sets the scene, and listeners, hopefully, you're familiar, with some of those brands, and that kind of gives you a sense of what sort of temporal vibe we're looking for in terms of the beers that were available to your average New York State drinker who might pop into his or her local bodega or supermarket and try to pick up a 6-pack. So, Chris, at this time in 2012, we're looking. New York State politicians are looking around the country. They're seeing New York falling behind. They're seeing this opportunity, to bring jobs to the state, which, by the way, coming out of the recession, the mortgage crisis and whatnot in 2007, 2008, I think by 2012, I looked this up before we started this episode, the unemployment rate in New York was still very high. It was like 8.9% at this time. So it by no means has the state recovered from the mortgage crisis, the subprime mortgage lending crisis. Obviously, that recovery was unequal, while economic powerhouses like New York City bounced back relatively quickly. These more economically depressed regions in upstate are struggling harder with it. And this is another reason that, man, we got to get this craft beverage industry firing on all cylinders, or at least on more cylinders. So that's where we're at in 2012. And enter the scene, big friend of the pod, Governor Andrew Cuomo. I'm kidding, listener. Please don't scroll away on Spotify or Apple Music. I swear I'm kidding. Andrew Cuomo is not a friend of the Taplines podcast. That was a joke. Chris hung his head in shame at my feeble attempt at humor. But at the time, Andrew Cuomo is governor of New York. Everyone is talking about this guy heading for the White House, making a presidential run. He is in what would later, in hindsight, be close to his political prime, let's say. And he takes up the cause of craft beverage producers in New York, and that ultimately takes the shape of what it becomes called the Wine, Beer, and Spirits Summit in 2012. And Chris, I know you may not know exactly why he took up the cause, but do you have any sense for how this thing came together?
I mean, I know that the State Brewers Association had been a part of conversations across the wine, beer, and spirits industries to try to get something moving, because it was a growing segment of the economy at a time when other segments were struggling.
Yep.
So they saw it as an opportunity to get the ear of the governor and his office and other leaders in Albany around how this could be an economic growth opportunity. And also on the side, see some reforms happen from a regulatory perspective.
Right.
One thing that's really interesting and I want to point out, yes, it was wine, beer, and spirits, and obviously we're talking mostly about beer. But one of the first reforms that the State Brewers Association really wanted to push was to put beer on an equal footing with wine, because wine had seen massive growth in production in New York back in the 70s. You saw the Finger Lakes region become a hotbed for wine.
Yep.
And as a result, the farm winery license was created back then. And
1976. Yeah.
yeah. And you would think that, the next natural step would be a farm brewery license. The model's already there. It clearly works, and it could be another opportunity for manufacturing and agriculture to both see growth.
Yep.
So I think that was a good story, and that probably caught the ear of some of the state's leaders. And honestly, I think the way they would sell it in, it's an easy win. Beer is
Totally.
not a controversial subject. It's bipartisan. Most of the reforms that happened were, overwhelmingly approved in the legislature. So these are easy wins for. So why wouldn't a governor take an opportunity to get an easy win?
Especially
Any
not.
politician.
Yeah, especially not one as image conscious and savvy for all his many awful characteristics and awful behavior that's been well documented. Cuomo was nothing if not savvy. I mean, he was, in many ways a power broker in New York, for 2 decades before he got the governor's mansion. So it's an obvious opportunity to burnish your political bona fides and maybe add that to the old resume for, again, at that time, there was near constant chatter about the imminent or the inevitable Cuomo presidential run to the White House. Obviously, things didn't work out that way, and that's for the best, I would say, based on what we now know. But you can obviously see that there's a political element to it too, where it's an attractive, as you said, it's an easy win, right? The farm winery license thing, so that's been on the books in New York at this point since 1976. So you're going on 4 decades with that on the books. And what I think is interesting about that is and something that I wanted to emphasize in this episode is there's this book called How to Kill a City by P. Moskowitz. That's about gentrification, and it's not too relevant to what we're talking about today. But the aspect the theme that the author hammers home is that these things, gentrification doesn't just happen, right? It looks like it happens. Craft breweries that show up in your neighborhood, or third wave coffee places that show up in your neighborhood, or yoga studios that show up in your neighborhood, they look to be advancing gentrification. But by the time those businesses actually show up, the die has already been cast by policy making, by zoning, by all of the sort of machinations of municipal and local and state government to create the economic viability or the economic conditions for development to take place in specific ways. And the parallel I sort of see there, I want to draw there, is that New York State's wineries didn't just happen, right? We think about New York as a major wine producing region now, and certainly the terroir of the soil and the temperate climate, and out in the North Fork, the sea breeze coming in off the Atlantic and off the Long Island Sound. Those are all beneficial aspects of the viticulture in New York. But what created, or what sort of helped the industry explode into what it is now, was a set of policy decisions to allow wineries to access licenses and the proper sort of business documents to be able to operate, right? And so we know that backdrop, right? These are policy making decisions. These are not just sort of organic things that kind of happen. It's not open fermentation, right? These things aren't just sporadic, but so New York brewers are looking at that, and it's always easier to get a law on the books if there's already one that's similar, and you can say, hey, look at this one. We could just do this, but for our thing, and it's less scary. Frankly, a lot of lawmakers are lazy and want easy wins, not hard wins where they have to hammer out, the language of a bill, God forbid, from a blank piece of paper. Can you imagine, Chris? So as you say, the Farm Winery Act of 1976 provides sort of this template or this foothold, maybe this talking point that the Brewers Guild can get the ear of Cuomo's office or someone in Cuomo's office, or maybe Cuomo himself, although he, I think, never really, I don't think he like really ever made a big scene about being a big beer fan, right? He like kind of said he was to some extent, but like he wasn't like a big beer guy.
No. I mean, yeah, no, he was not. You know, I'm trying to think the interactions that I had with him at beer events, if there was anything that was in particular that struck me as him being knowledgeable about beer. No, not at all.
Yeah, and it's never been right. Yeah, it's absolutely not. But yeah, okay. So in 2012, they decided to have this summit. I know you weren't able to attend the summit in person yourself, but we won't dock you any points for that because you travel so much that I think, we'll give you a mulligan on that one. But you did, I think you told me you watched it on, you streamed it live.
I streamed it. And you were like, they had that technology in 2012? I'm like, yeah, believe it or not, they did. You know, I even went back to look at my article about it to make sure I was not imagining that. And I had a screen cap in the article.
So what was the resolution? Like 480p?
Oh, it was terrible. It's terrible. You can barely make out that it's actually Andrew Cuomo that's sitting at the table there. But so
you live streamed the summit, right?
Yeah. Yep. And that was in October of 2012. And basically it started as a listening session. The summit, they did another summit 2 years later that was similarly structured, where they had members of the industry sitting on the sides, and then you had state government officials at the front of the room, and they were just going one by one. Here's what we need to succeed. Here's what's not working for us. And it really was a listening session. It was an honest listening session. I remember, I can't remember which member of the beer industry who was speaking. There were I think four guys. There was Dave Ketelowski, and then there was someone from FX Matt, Genesee, and CH Evans in Albany. And one of them pointed out one of the more ridiculous regulations in New York State at the time for brewers was if you attended a beer festival, a member of the brewing staff could not pour beer.
Because it had to be like a specially licensed caterer type of thing,
right? Well, it just couldn't be, and because that would circumvent the 3-tier system. Seriously,
that fucking rocks.
That's how absurd some of the regulations were.
2012. We laugh now, but you're right. I mean, 11 years ago, like this is a totally different landscape, and that that stuff wasn't even as restrictive as. I used to live in South Carolina, and they didn't up the ABV until maybe 2014. And I mean, Oklahoma, I think, still has a whatever. The point is that, like, that in 2012, that's like, even though we cackle about it now, or I do, it's this is very much like that's the milieu, right?
Yeah, and I recall Governor Cuomo at the time, upon hearing that, immediately reacting like, "What? You can't pour your own beer?"
Right. Proving
that doesn't make any sense.
Proving that Cuomo was at least at one point like an empathetic human with like a capacity to relate to others. Even he, upon hearing about the 3-tier system, was like, "That's crazy. I don't think that's right. I'm going to look into this."
And 3 years later, we found more ways to circumvent the 3-tier system.
Right.
But yeah, so that was one that stood out. It was also kind of a that morning session ended with some like big economic development announcements. So like government grants and things that were going to the industries that were at the table. Mm-hmm. So things like, and that was actually where they announced the Taste New York campaign, which still exists to this day.
Yeah.
Just a statewide promotion of craft beverages across the board. That was when they announced that the New York State Fair would serve craft beer for the first time from New York State breweries, which seems like a very logical thing that should have been done a while ago, considering
it's just incredibly quaint. Like, yeah.
And it was also where they announced the just acknowledge that there needs to be an industry resource for the state at the state liquor authority to try to help breweries move faster through the application process to
Right.
start, to open. And then in the afternoon session, after they had regrouped, they announced basically what the wish list would be for getting regulatory changes pushed through the legislature. So that was where the combined license came from. So a brewery and a winery and a distillery could all operate under one roof. That was where when they announced that they were getting rid of the pour your own beer
At the
restriction.
test, yeah, right.
Yep. Also, you also had to get a annual tasting permit at the time, which was $1,000 a year just to be able to attend events and pour beer at those events. So that was reformed as well. They had they also, that's right. I've completely forgotten this. It just came to me. So you had to register with you had to file a license with both the state liquor authority and the Department of Agriculture at the time.
Right.
And that would go away too. So those were little victories, but they led the state's beer industry down a path that they had clearly opened up a line of communication, and the conversations that happened at that first summit around opportunities around beer agriculture and things like that would come to the forefront 2 years later at the next summit, when they ultimately got the farm brewery law passed. And that was when they looked back at 2012 and said, hey, here are the victories that we've already had so far. They saw jobs in the beer sector triple so that now the question is, would that have happened naturally? It might have. I mean, there were obviously some regulatory things that were holding back the industry, but the trajectory across the country was pretty aggressive growth in craft beer at that time. So maybe they would have doubled instead of tripling.
Right.
It's still a small victory. Well, it's a big victory, really, but is it a victory for what was discussed in 2012? Yeah, a little bit. So the big thing at that time was the state liquor authority's response time on applications dropped by something like 60%. So that was clearly a sign that they had invested in a regulatory structure that would actually help support growth of the industry, because that dropped at a time when even more applications were coming in because there were so many more breweries opening in the state.
And to your point, to some extent, that is just the growth of the industry, which was at that point hitting its sort of heyday across the country. So there are more people talking about craft beer. That's obviously generating more sort of business plans, and people are more interested in investing in the space, et cetera, et cetera. So there's some sort of latent momentum there, but for the state to be able to meet the moment and reduce its processing time, again, wonky, but really fucking important if you're trying to run a business, is a big deal, right? They're facing more, they're doing it faster. They've obviously prioritized this in a way that the brewers had been, begging for a while, and things are kind of a well-oiled, or closer to a well-oiled machine.
Right. And the year prior to the second summit was when the farm brewery license was instituted. So the timeline there was summit, where we're just trying to get some basic regulatory restrictions off the books. Next year, farm brewery license. Year after that is what they call the Craft New York Act, which really, really started to open the floodgates. So it raised production caps, so more of the larger breweries could continue to operate under the same license rather than having to hold a second, far more expensive license. There's the microbrewery license, and then there's the class class D license, I think it is. It's the largest brewery license. It was like there were, I think, 3 breweries in the state that held this license, but as craft breweries started to grow, especially the larger ones, they were foreseeing an issue with having to pay for this much more expensive license, which would have had implications for those breweries and may have stunted their growth. In fact, they may have been like, you know what, maybe it's not worth it for us to, double our capacity if it's going to mean that we're going to have to pay, higher fees to the state.
Right.
That was what allowed. So that actually allowed the direct shipment of beer, which was a godsend in 2020 during COVID, where New York State breweries were able to ship across the state. I got beer from breweries in Buffalo and the Finger Lakes and Albany while I was cooped up here in this apartment. So that was a big win. And then there were separate licenses required for both. There's a microbrewery license and a brewery retail license. So just selling beer at your brewery required a different license than having a manufacturing facility and tap room. So that was eventually eliminated too. So we saw some big wins that year, and that was also when they started to put their money where their mouth is around farm breweries and promoting agriculture, because you had this farm brewery license, which had some not aggressive requirements at the time, but it required like 25% of all the raw materials in your beer to be sourced from within New York State. And at the time that bill was passed, there was not a malt house in New York. So you could buy New York grown malt, but it was malted in Massachusetts.
Right. It had to be malted out of state and then trucked back in. Obviously not very attractive for the margin.
Exactly.
Yeah, wait, let's pause there for a second. What were, because I think it's important to, to unpack a little bit the machinery of the Farm Bill and sort of the way it attempts to, and ultimately does. It is successful. That's the spoiler alert at the end. It is a tremendous success, I think, by most measures. But the way this machine is structured or built out to try to create virtuous cycles in a symbiotic relationship between New York agriculture and New York breweries. What's the mechanism there, Chris?
So, I mean, the issue really was that it was designed as a way to spur growth in agriculture. The bill, said that, until a certain point, and this was actually one of my issues with the original law that was passed that still holds true now, is that it wasn't that, okay, so say you're a brewery and you get a farm brewery license, whether you started 2 years before the deadline or 4 years before the deadline, when that deadline came, you had to step up the amount of raw materials you were sourcing from New York State from 20% to 50%.
Right.
What it did is said, when you open, when this bill passed, it'll be 20%. But what I thought would be more ideal is, okay, when you get that farm brewery license for the first time,
right, it should be rolling. Yeah.
Right. It should be on a rolling basis. And that actually put us in a bit of a pickle where, there just simply wasn't enough. There were enough raw materials to satisfy the bare requirements, but there was not enough for, say, more than a handful of breweries to source 100% of their ingredients from New York State if they wanted to. That so that just
because there aren't enough hop farms, because there aren't enough malt. There is not enough barley, that's of malting quality. There aren't, to your point, there's not a malt house in New York. So
at the time,
the time, the economics of it aren't attractive. So the idea of this farm brewery license, which becomes extremely attractive for potential brewery owners who are looking to start a brewery, for all the reasons you mentioned about the expedited opportunity to get a license without some of the bureaucracy. It's much more streamlined. It's a way to launch this business much more quickly and effectively, with lower overhead in terms of time and in terms of navigating the way Albany works and the way the local municipalities work. So there's a lot of brewery owners that want this license and that go get this license. But again, when you talk about raw materials, you're literally talking about, well, I need to have 20% of my hops coming from New York farms. I need to have 20% of my other ingredients coming from New York farms. I think that was the requirement until 2018. And then it steps up to 50%. And then it steps up, I think it's supposed to step up again to 90% in 2024?
It was supposed to. That's been pushed to 2028, which was entirely my point. when that bill was passed, I was like, we're going to hit a time where there's no way that we could hit 90%. That's completely wishful thinking. And the more frustrating thing that to me was they also weren't putting money into hop research at the time, agricultural research around creating hop varieties that'll grow well in New York State,
resilient in New York State.
Yeah. So they have since started that process, but that process should have started 10 years ago when the farm brewery law was passed.
Sure.
Rather than 4 or 5 years ago. In order to satisfy that requirement. So, the writing was on the wall that deadline was going to have to be pushed.
They created a bottleneck for themselves, 5 years down, 10 years down the road. And they never really course corrected to accommodate it. Yeah.
But in spite all that, despite the faults of the bill itself, it did what it was intended to do. It spurred growth in the beer industry. It spurred growth in beer agriculture. New York is typically either fourth or fifth in hop growth in the United States. Mm-hmm. I mean, the drop between Idaho and New York is like the gap is massive. I mean, we're talking
we're like I forget what Division II football is called now, but you're the best. You're the University of Richmond in Division II football.
It's more like the drop from D1 to D3. It's actually maybe more the drop from like D1 to like junior college.
Right.
It's a massive drop. But
I mean, technically fifth. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So it did work to promote beer agriculture in the state. And historically, we had been a beer agriculture state. A large percentage of all the hops grown in the U.S. prior to Prohibition were grown in New York State. So we did have the climate for it. But we, the climate was more ideal, obviously, in the Pacific Northwest, but we can do it. we can grow these.
Right.
So we did see big growth in hop growing. We saw malt houses open. We saw, farmers specialize in beer grains, even specialty grains, so that brewers who wanted to source all of their grain from New York State could, regardless of what types they wanted to use. I think it did what it was intended to do. And it really did help, especially upstate. It really helped to spur growth in the beer industry, because it gave brewers that have very low overhead the opportunity to reduce that even more. If you're just a small brewer who wants to run on a 3-barrel system in a garage and, Olean, you can do that.
Yeah, the suburbs of Poughkeepsie or whatever. Yeah.
Sure. So I think that, that was really the catalyst for some of the growth we saw between 2014 and 2018, which, I mean, New York State was just flying in terms of their rank on the list of most breweries in the country,
which were also growing quite rapidly at that time, because this is the heyday. So it's not like you're flying past, kids on a tricycle, driving a car. Like you're moving with the pack and moving past a pack that's already going quite high velocity at that time.
Yeah. I mean, if you had told me in 2014 that within 5 years, New York State would have more breweries than Colorado, I would have just been like, no way. There's no way that's happening. Colorado's like the beer mecca. Yeah. And sure enough, that happened. I mean, we still have about 200 more than they do.
Yeah. Because there's so many fucking people in New York, because the reality is like there's this basically the sleeping giant of a state, economy that was just like waiting to be fired up on craft beer and needed the right push.
Yeah. So again, putting that into perspective, as you mentioned, think about the number of breweries nationally. Went from like 1,000 to 8,000 over that period, or 1,000 to 7,000, I think, over that 5-year period. But New York went from about I remember we kind of celebrated when we hit 100 in 2013, but and they're over 500 now.
Yeah.
In spite of some of the closings we've seen in the last the last 2 years, and for every closing, there seems to be an opening to offset that. So
almost 1-to-1 still in 2022. I don't know if you dialed in, but Bart Watson, who's the chief economist of the Brewers Association, who's been a tremendous source for me over the years. You actually were the one who first put me in touch with Bart, or told me to go look him up. But anyway, Bart does the state of the industry thing every year, and I dialed in, and the openings and closures are 1-to-1. He jokes because he's been sort of calling that canary in the coal mine for a couple years now, and it refuses to die. Like, we have not seen that flip into negative growth.
Say, and I'll say that you got to consider, one of the things is that it's still some people's dream to open a brewery, right? And when they can do it on the cheap because they've already got a turnkey operation that they can pick up, like it's not just necessarily 1-to-1 in the sense that a brewery can open in one place and close in another.
Right.
It may be the same location.
Same location. Right. Yeah, it's the hermit crab thing. Right. Yeah. Like it's similar to restaurants. Like if the stainless steel hood and the range is already there, and all the fucking tables and silverware is available for sale from the same broker who's happy to sign over the lease. Like, well, guess what, man? Like, that's going to be a restaurant forever. It may not be the same restaurant, but it's going to be a restaurant. Yeah.
Even in cursed spaces.
Right. Yeah. Right. Exactly. So the farm brewery license, I want to throw some numbers at you here. I'm gonna just quote quickly from a 5-year retrospective that Chris Crowell did over at craftbrewingbusiness.com. But here's the numbers, so a quote: the number of breweries has skyrocketed in New York since Governor Andrew Cuomo hosted the state's first wine, beer, and spirits summit in 2012, with 243 new breweries obtaining licenses and beer being brewed in 57 of the state's 62 counties. Additionally, 202 new farm brewery licenses have been issued since the governor's farm brewery law went into effect, mirroring the highly successful 1960 Farm Winery Act, blah, 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 close quote. So we're talking about, that's in 2018. So 243 new brewery licenses, 202 new farm brewery licenses. We're talking about just an enormous amount of growth, as you've described here. And I think that's a good way to segue into, the sort of what I wanted to talk to you about, because, as I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, you are so well traveled, you are so well plugged into not only how brewing, is going in the state of New York, but all across the country. This wound up being a fairly influential model, which other states, if I understand correctly, other states, sort of look to emulate in some capacity or another. I'm curious whether any state in particular jump out to you as ones that you could see echoes of New York State's moves, or if it was obvious that they were looking at what New York State was doing.
So I don't think there are any that have really latched onto the beer agriculture model.
Yep.
But definitely in the model of engaging state government in law and reform,
right?
Regulatory reform to try to get more breweries to open, or to allow breweries to open more quickly, on the basis of promoting economic growth, has really become a model. And I mean, you actually brought it up earlier. One state that comes to mind is Oklahoma. Right. Oklahoma had massive issues when it came to regulatory restrictions that just held back that entire industry for so long. And I remember being in Oklahoma City in 2015, when they were on the cusp of some of the reforms that finally happened with their state's Brewers Association, and the handful of breweries that were there at the time.
Mm-hmm.
I asked, okay, there's 5 breweries in Oklahoma City right now. How many do you think are just waiting in the wings just here? And they're like, 15 easily.
Wow.
Yeah,
3 times
you're
as
talking,
many.
Yeah. So, and sure enough, when I went back to Oklahoma City for the first time last year, since then, there were like 20 plus breweries in Oklahoma City. So, and that was part of the argument for why we need to reform the regulatory system in the state, is because it will help promote economic growth. It will create manufacturing jobs. That's always something that just like flashes, dollar signs in the eyes of
red
politicians.
Meat meat for a state politician is, we're bringing manufacturing jobs back to my district. Yeah.
Yep, exactly. So, and that is, it's a model that I think could work in, I mean, there's still a handful of states that have laws that are holding them back, like the one immediately across the Hudson River from me right now.
Shout out to another big friend of the pod, Governor Phil Murphy of New Jersey, of course. Again, I am kidding. As we record this, our man Murphy down in Trenton, New Jersey is playing spoiler on a unanimously passed 77-0, meaning no one even abstained, bill to reform New Jersey's taproom laws that have been on the books for a while around tap rooms and brewery shit that is arcane and really only benefits the state's powerful restaurant and bar lobby. The tri-state area is full of bullshit when it comes to booze bureaucracy, Chris. You make a very good point. Yeah. But to your...
we're not special. I mean, like, in New Jersey has the same problem that Alaska and Montana do, where...
Too much land.
Don't think that's New Jersey's problem, but I mean, the Pine Barrens are kind of empty, but they all allow liquor license holders to sell their license at for fair market value to another buyer. And, that means that if you hold a liquor license, you're sitting on a value of sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars. And you see someone get a brewery license down the street for $2,000 or $3,000. And you're like, well, that's not fair.
Mm-hmm.
And what I say to that in New Jersey is, if you want to go through the process of opening a brewery and the construction that goes along with that, and hiring a brewer and packaging, finding a distributor, by all means do that.
Right.
If it seems so easy to you,
right. Just do the thing. Then you should just sell your bar license and buy a cheaper brewery license.
Yeah. If that was so easy, then people would be doing that, but no one in their right mind would in New Jersey. So
right.
It's silly. I mean, that's why Montana and Alaska have some more draconian restrictions on brewery tap rooms as well, for the same reason. It's funny to see that common thread, but that is where, look, going back to just how state government works, right? there was no beer lobby before we got the got the ear of Andrew Cuomo here
in 2012.
Yeah. I mean, there was a Brewers Association,
and
but
there was
there
was a beer distributors lobby.
Oh, sure. Oh, for sure. Right. But there wasn't really a beer manufacturers lobby. I mean, there were a few large breweries that obviously, had friends in state government. Sure. But it wasn't the big lobbies at the time were the restaurant and bar lobby and the distributors lobby. So and they're powerful. There's a heck of a lot more bars and restaurants than there are breweries in every single state. So they're always going to have, they're going to wield their power when they feel threatened. And I think what happened in New York that is kind of a model is that, we engaged with other sectors that could see growth as a result of growth in beer, tourism, agriculture. Yeah. These are areas that could stand to benefit from a reform, and it probably we'd say a rising tide raises all boats. But hey, you know what? If more people are coming to visit breweries, they're also going to visit bars and restaurants too. They're not just going to go to breweries.
Right. There's a halo effect from gastro-tourism, if you want to lump it under that big umbrella. Yeah, right. Exactly.
Yeah. So, that's how you kind of neutralize the threat that is seen by people who have, spent hundreds of thousands of dollars to build a restaurant and see a tap room down the street as a threat. It's funny. I think about like the towns I've been to in New Jersey where I've gone to tap rooms, and then because I couldn't eat there, I went to a restaurant. But if I could eat there, I probably would have stayed longer in that town and maybe stayed for 2 meals.
Sure.
So there's a lot of threats to. There's a lot of people who feel threatened there, and I think the way we went about it in New York was just it really was an opportunity that I don't think is one that many other states have, unless they have a true opportunity to grow both hops and malt. You're not going to get a farm brewery law passed in Florida. But there's definitely something to be learned from, engaging with the right people and finding the right message. And I think that's what made that summit so successful. And I think that's what has made New York's, beer industry so successful over the 11 years since.
And it's a success that I think, not that this podcast carries any water for Andrew Cuomo or any politician for that matter. Taplines pulls no punches, but it does speak to the fact that, like, as fucking odious as it is and as he is or turned out to be, like, there's just like a degree of horse trading that has to happen. Like, you find allies where you can. He was interested in the jobs aspect of it at that time. Clearly, like, not that interested in like the actual, businesses, as we discussed before. It wasn't clear that he really was a big drinker at all. And actually, there's a quote from the New York Times. I'm going to quote. Someone asked him if he's more of a beer guy or a wine guy, and he responds, quote, that he's a beer and wine and hard cider and distilled products guy, which, like, very normal way to say that, you fucking weirdo. but you know what? He showed up and he moved some stuff through. So, you know what? How about that? The world's not always black and white, and
no.
People contain multitudes.
Exactly.
This is a lesson that I refuse to learn, and listeners, I urge you not to learn it either. But Chris, thank you so much for coming and for bringing us back to 2012 and that beer summit that sort of changed the direction for New York's craft brewing industry. Chris, thanks so much. I really appreciate you coming by. You're welcome back on Taplines anytime. And stay safe out there as you fly from one corner of the globe to the other.
I will. Thanks for having me.
Take care, man. Taplines is recorded in Richmond, Virginia, and produced by yours truly and Darby Seaside, who, along with the talented Shane Farrick, composed our delightful soundtrack. Just listen to it. I also want to give a quick shout out to the entire VinePair team, and especially co-founders Adam Teeter and Josh Mallon, editor-in-chief Joanna Sciarrino, managing editor Tim McCurdy, and art director Danielle Grinberg, who designed our lovely Taplines logo. And of course, a big thank you to you, yes you listener, for spending time with us week in and week out. We literally couldn't do this without you. I'm Dave Infante, and I'll catch you next time.